When I thought field of cloth of gold, I of course thought gold. I'm totally enamored with illuminated manuscripts, exquisite gems that have survived centuries, still glittering in their golden sumptuous colours. So who better to have with us than Patricia Lovett, professional scribe, illuminator and chair of Heritage Crafts Association. Some of you might remember her from her involvement in the phenomenal Anglo-Saxon exhibition at the British Library very recently, or more home to us perhaps her involvement in the BBC adaptation of Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall when she created the Book of Hours, a replica of it that was supposed to be in the Cromwell family. So I hope you enjoy our selection of tips on calligraphy and how to do this. She has lots more on her website and I cannot thank her enough for agreeing to do this with us. Thank you, Patricia.
When starting out in calligraphy, it's often difficult to know what sort of paper to use because there's so much available on the market. I would recommend that you start with layout paper, and here you can see it's produced in a pad specially for calligraphy. Not all layout paper is suitable. Some is too shiny and some allows the ink to bleed. A3 is the size. On the back of this pad there is a guide to writing the foundational hand as well. Layout paper is thin, as you can see. It's so thin that you can actually trace through letters. If you come on a workshop of mine, this is a workshop for Gothic script, you can actually trace through the letter forms on the sheets that you're given. As well as that, you actually only need to draw one set of lines instead of the perpetual lines that we seem to be drawing for calligraphy. And with layout paper, you can trace through the lines, as you can see here, the lines for X height and the lines for ascenders and descenders. If you're wanting to give someone a present though of calligraphy, then layout paper is obviously too thin. And so this second pad is for cartridge paper, which is more robust and has a heavier weight. On the back of this pad, it shows you how to write italic letter forms. This paper, as you can see in here, is that much more robust and is absolutely perfect for writing pieces that you want to give to your friends and family or put in exhibitions. The surface of this paper is hot pressed. That means it's been passed through hot rollers, a little bit like ironing. And the sort of letter forms that you get with hot press paper are smooth and very, very crisp, like these. If the paper hasn't been passed through hot rollers, it's called not, because it's not been passed through hot rollers. In America, this is called cold pressed, and the type of letter forms that you get on not paper are less crisp and less precise, so the edges are slightly broken. The third paper finish is called rough, and this is rough paper, and you can see it's very textured, it's not passed through any rollers at all, and it's quite challenging for writing calligraphy. I would suggest that you use either a very, very fine pen or a very broad one, but that's certainly something that you shouldn't be attempting when you're just starting out. There are a number of different pens available for calligraphy, and for writing the letter forms like these, you need pens that have a broad edge, as these do, because this broad edge creates the characteristic thicks and thins as you move the pen over the paper. One of the cheapest and often the most easily accessible is the felt tip pen, which you can see here has quite a broad edge nib. This pen avoids the problems of ink supply, spillages with ink bottles, and it's easy to practice and do roughs with a felt tip pen. But because the very edge, the very tip of a felt tip pen is thick-ish, you won't get these wonderful fine lines that you do with a nib, such as a metal nib, of other pens. A calligraphy fountain pen also avoids the problems of ink supply and ink spillage, and you can make reasonable letter forms with it, but because the nib is often quite rigid, it doesn't have the flexibility of calligraphy dip pens. As well as this, the ink that you need to feed into a fountain pen is quite thin, and so you see the guidelines beneath the ink, and the metal that's used is quite rigid. I suppose the cheapest pen of all is a feather that you can pick up in bird sanctuaries or where there are lakes, but it does need some skill and careful instructions to cut a quill from a feather. This actually is a swan's feather, and for that you'll need my DVD on illumination. What most people use are these. These are broad edge nibs, which are supplied both in sets of 10, and the width extends from a size 0 to a size 6, 0 to 1, 1.5, 2, 2.5, 3, 3.5, 4, 5, 6, with reservoirs that slide on underneath. You can buy them either in sets like this, or you can buy nibs singly. And if you're just starting out, I would recommend either a size 0 or a size 1, because as I've said before, it's much better to start your lettering when you have a wide nib so that you can see your letter forms more clearly. These nibs need to be pushed into a pen holder, and I've got 3 here. One which has a cork grip, which is really very comfortable to use. This one which has a triangular holder, which many people find comfortable to use. And this one, which is not available in the shops because this is a whole box of pens that I saved me being thrown out from school I was teaching in many years ago. And because my hands are quite small and I like to use a quill, I do like a narrow pen holder. But as I say, that's unlikely to be available now. So choose a pen holder that is most comfortable for you and your size of hand. A calligraphy dip pen needs to be put together. The nib should be pushed into the pen holder firmly and securely. It shouldn't wobble around. The reservoir slides on underneath the pen nib. The reservoirs are quite flexible, as you can see, and the tip needs to be bent so that it touches the nib about 2 millimeters from the very tip of the nib. If it doesn't touch, and this is ridiculously far away, it can't do its job of feeding the ink into the nib tip. So you'll need to slide it off, adjust that, and slide it on again. If that's bent too far forward, sometimes, particularly on narrow nibs, that can push the 2 sides of the nibs apart, and so you get a stroke which has a gap down the middle of it. The 2 side lugs here of the reservoir can also be adjusted, because if they're too tight, they push the 2 sides of the pen nib so that they cross over one another and you can't write with them properly. Although these are often called dip nibs, if you dip the pen into ink, very often you get a blob on the top of your lettering, and that ruins your first stroke. So rather than dipping, you use a cheap brush and simply stroke it on the side or the underneath of the nib, and the ink then collects between the reservoir and the nib, and this saves you having to dip too frequently or feed the ink in too frequently. The pen often needs coaxing to get to write, so it usually doesn't write straight away. To get it to write, go back and forwards along the narrow part of the nib, and when that's writing nicely and the ink is flowing, then you can start to make your straight, thick strokes. There are a number of inks that are available for calligraphy, but in fact not all are suitable. Some of the ink that is specifically sold for calligraphy is the most unsuitable of all. Some calligraphy ink is very thin. It's perfect for going through a fountain pen, but it's so thin that you can see guidelines underneath your letter forms. Other calligraphy ink is sold as waterproof, and this may mean that it has shellac in it. shellac will clog your pen, and so if you're having difficulty with writing, it may not be you, it may be the ink that you're using. Chinese liquid ink is perfect for Western calligraphy. It's sold in specialist suppliers and also in shops that supply Chinese writing equipment. In this container, though, it isn't appropriate to use, so we need to decant it to a small little jar like this. This is very similar to the jars where you get preserves and marmalades in some hotels, but those little jars have a domed bottom. And what happens is if you haven't got much ink in there, the ink collects around the base of the dome and is quite difficult to use. Here you can see the base is flat. Again, these little jars are available from specialist suppliers. Simply decant some ink from the bottle into your jar and try it. If it's a bit thick and sticky, add water, and this is perfect for adding water, an ink dropper, again available from specialist suppliers, and you can dilute Chinese ink up to 50-50. You want it the consistency of thin runny cream, that is, thick enough to cover your guidelines, but not so thick that it won't go through your nib. And it's always a good idea to put the lid on securely before you move it around. Chinese ink is also available in sticks like this, and these often come in sets with an inkstone. The Chinese value their writing equipment a great deal, and inkstones can be very beautifully carved and very elaborate, but this rather cheap one, which is in slate, is perfectly okay for our purposes. To change that solid ink into liquid ink, you need to add some water into the well of the inkstone and then just rub the inkstone up and down like this until the ink block gradually dissolves into the water, and again you need it the consistency of thin runny cream. Don't grind up too much because the ink stays pretty well in a solid state, just as much as you need, and again then that needs to be decanted into a little jar because otherwise this huge surface area will mean that the water evaporates too quickly. There are also paints available for calligraphy, and this is a set of paints that I developed with the Schminke Paint Company. This is calligraphy gouache. It comes in a rather worn and torn box here, and as well as this there is a leaflet that gives you some ideas of how to use the paints. 2 yellows, 2 reds, 2 blues, 2 blacks, a green. An oxide of chromium isn't the very best green colour, but it's wonderful through a pen nib. Burnt sienna as a brown, which mixed with ultramarine makes the most fantastic grey. And then 2 metallic colours, red pearl and gold pearl. And if you're not used to using metallic colours through a nib, then do get my DVD on illumination, which gives you lots of hints, and then a white. Gouache is opaque. It's like watercolour, but it is opaque, and so it needs to be mixed with water, again to the consistency of thin runny cream. And this ink dropper is perfect for adding water a little by little. Mix it up until all the paint has dissolved. If you don't do that, as you're working, some of that paint will dissolve and will change the consistency. This is too thick. It needs to be thinner than that, and as you can see, this is about the consistency of thin runny cream, which will then work well with a pen nib. This is actually my preferred container. This is a science crucible, and you can see that the surface area here is less than a container like this, and they often have lids that you can put on, and so you can keep the paint for as long as you wish. Don't ever wash up paint palettes because the paint will keep. Just simply add water, and the ideal is a white palette because it shows the colour best. There are 3 things that you need to bear in mind with calligraphy. The first is the angle that you hold your pen nib compared with the horizontal line, not the angle that you hold your pen in your hand, but this nib against the horizontal line. Let me show you. If I write with my nib at 0 degrees to the horizontal line, the shape of the letter that I get, not a particularly good letter, is quite different from if I write with my nib at 90 degrees to a horizontal line. Notice where the thicks and thins are, and also the shape of the inside. That white space is called the counter. Compared with if I write with my nib at 45 degrees, and even if I just flatten it slightly by 15 degrees, you'll see the thicks and the thins are in different places. And in calligraphy, it's very important to know the angle compared with the horizontal of the writing style that you're doing. So, for example, most lettering, like italic, the foundational hand and Gothic, are in holding your hand in a comfortable position. Uncial and half uncial are in often a flat nib angle, and rustics in a more pronounced nib angle. As well as this, the width of this nib determines how big your letters are going to be. So wider nibs give bigger letters, smaller nibs, narrower nibs give smaller letters, which does seem obvious, but let me just show you. If I do a series, let me move that up a little, a series of letters A, I'm using, of course, oops, need some more ink, the same pen for all of these letters. The ones that are smaller look chunkier because of the proportion of the width of the nib compared with the height of the letters, whereas this letter here looks very elegant. More ink again. More elegant because the letter is bigger compared with the size of the nib. So to determine how big the letter should be, you turn your nib on its side, and so your angle is 90 degrees, and make a series of little steps which just touch one another and don't overlap. And that will give you your X height. So for example, an X height of 5 nib widths is the X height for italic, as here, and also for Gothic black letter, as here. Now you'll see while I was doing that I took the pen off between the strokes. So generally in calligraphy you pull your pen down or to the right, because if you push the nib, just smooth that out a bit to make a letter a little bit better, if you push the nib against the width of the nib, it really doesn't want to go there. And so you make the letters in a series of separate strokes, lifting the pen between each stroke. You've measured out your lines for X height by turning your pen to an angle of 90 degrees and making a series of little steps, so you've got the width of the nib here, and these little steps just touch one another and don't overlap. So you know that that distance is the distance of your X height. The ascenders extend beyond, the descenders descend obviously beyond that way. This is the space between your lines. So how do you transfer these measurements onto another piece of paper? Well, the most obvious way, I suppose, is to use a ruler, and the trouble with this is that rarely have you got convenient measurements, and that is exactly the case here. It's 18.5 millimetres for the lines for X height, and the interlinear space, the space between the lines, is 25.5 millimetres. So using a ruler, I can measure out, and it's going to take some time, 18.5 millimetres, particularly getting it accurate, 25.5 millimetres, 18.5, and so on. A slightly easier way is to use a piece of scrap paper and just mark on the scrap paper where those lines are, and this can then be used on your other paper. And you can see already this is quicker. That's the top line for X height, the bottom line for X height, interlinear space, and so on. A far more accurate way though, and one that I very much prefer and use all the time, is to use these, which are dividers. These are compasses, and good quality compasses have this central wheel, so these arms aren't going anywhere unless I move that wheel. And good quality compasses also have a spare point, so I've simply taken out the pencil lead and replaced it with a point. And using the wheel, I adjust the width between the arms, so that is the X height, and then the interlinear space, just close that up a bit, is this. And then that's really quite a simple exercise to walk these compasses down. That goes in the hole of the previous one, that goes in the hole of that one. I'm doing that with my left hand. Normally I do these both with my right hand, and so on down the paper. And these pinprick marks give me the indications of where I need to draw my lines using a pencil and ruler. This series of calligraphy clips is about the writing style italic. This is italic here, and this shows you what the hand looks like when it's written in as continuous text. Before you start writing though, there are some things that you need to know. The first is that the X height, which is the height of a small letter X, is 5 nib widths. What you should do is turn your pen so that it is at 90 degrees to the horizontal and make a series of little steps which just touch one another and don't overlap. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The parts of the letter that go up, the ascenders, are 1, 2, 3, 4 nib widths more, and the parts of the letter that go down, the descenders, are also 4 nib widths more. So an ascender, or that stroke of the letter, is 9 nib widths in all, and that part of the letter is also 9 nib widths in all. The majuscules, or capital letters, are 7 nib widths high. They are smaller than the ascenders. The nib angle is 45 degrees to the horizontal. There is the horizontal at 0 degrees, and so you place your nib at 45 degrees, and this will give you the correct letter shapes. The shape, as you can see, of italic is narrow-ish. It's a narrow oval, and the hand has smooth curves rather than angles. If you have a look at the space within the letter there, this is called the counter, that's beautifully smooth, as indeed here. And the letters are not upright, they are written at a slight slant of 5 degrees. When calligraphy nibs are manufactured, the cutters produce a straight edge like this. To get these wonderfully fine lines though in calligraphy, often you need a much finer tip. And so I sharpen nibs to take a little bit of the edge off there, so what I'm writing with is much thinner and more flexible. I use an Arkansas, spelt Arkansas as in the state because that's where it comes from, sharpening stone, which is very, very fine. It's much finer than sandpaper or other sharpening stones. You can get these from the internet or from tool supply shops. The first thing that I need to do is to make sure that this very edge here is straight. And so although I would normally do this flat on a flat surface, I'm going to tip the stone so that you can see how I'm doing this on the film. I'm going to go backwards and forwards, and this sound might actually set some of your teeth on edge. Just a few times to ensure that that edge is absolutely straight. Now I'm going to sharpen the top of the nib, so I'm turning it over, and as this is quite a broad nib, I'm holding it at an angle of about 45 degrees. If it was a narrower nib, I'd change that to about 30 degrees. So supporting this part of the pen with my middle finger, I run this along the sharpening stone between 9 and 12 times, and you may just be able to see that tip there is now very, very shiny. In sharpening like this, some of the metal may have created burrs and be pulled down, and I need to remove those because otherwise it might tear the paper when writing. So I just take off with a couple of strokes on each corner and also on the flat part of the pen, and then I try it. If it isn't sharp enough, I can repeat the process. If I've been a bit enthusiastic and it's so sharp that it tears the paper, I just take the edge off a little by doing what I did to start with, which is to go back and forwards, and so I take a little bit off that front edge there. And you'll find it makes such a difference sharpening your pen nibs to your writing. Before you start writing, you need to make sure you have your lines drawn. So here we have the 5 nib widths for the X height, the extra 4 nib widths for the ascenders and descenders. And these are my lines for ascenders, X height and descenders. When you're starting calligraphy, it's also helpful to have additional guides. So here I've drawn lines at 45 degrees, which is the angle that I hold my pen, and also 5 degrees, which is the angle of slant. Rather than starting at A and finishing at Z, you'll make much quicker progress if you write the letters in families that have similar strokes. So the first family that we're going to start with is the family that starts with downstrokes. Getting my pen writing, and the letter I is the simplest letter to start with. So it is simply a downstroke, entry and exit stroke with the dot. If you exaggerate or change the angle, you can see you get a rather unfortunate letter. The letter L is the letter I extended. It has an ascender. And often it's better to extend the exit stroke very slightly, but you can keep it narrow if you wish. The letter T is a short letter. The crossbar for the letter T goes just underneath the line for X height. So if you start with the left-hand nib, just where the top guideline for X height is, make the stroke, and that is extended a little like the letter L, and then the crossbar. If you make the letter too large, it just looks silly. The letter U starts like the letter I, and then this stroke is pushed right up to the top. You take the pressure off, breathe in and push up to the top, because in that way you get this beautiful smooth curve. Let me do it again. Breathe in. It hasn't come out there very well, but you will. Just go over that, get that smooth curve. If you stop with that letter and don't push it up, no matter what you do, you will always have that angle there. So that needs to be pushed right up. And if you're going to do the letter Y based on that letter U, that is exactly the same. And then you would extend that down and just thicken it very slightly there. Letter J didn't exist in medieval manuscripts, so we have to make it up. And so you can see it is an amalgam of the letter I and the tail of that letter Y. The second letter family for italic is the family that starts with a downstroke and then the letters arch. The first letter for that is an R. And as before, we push up from the base and branch out about halfway. If we don't branch out at halfway and do it too soon, if the pen will write, or too late, the letter form is different. So this is about halfway. If we extend that letter R to the letter N, branching out as halfway as before, by pushing it up, you get that lovely, smooth inner curve, as you can see here. The letter M is the letter N, and that's second stroke again. Now the ink didn't flow properly just there, so I just went over it. And again, of course, this is at 45 degrees and with a slant of 5 degrees. Just a simple exit stroke on those letters. The letter H has an ascender and then is the letter N. The letter B is that downstroke again, branching out, hitting the top line for X height, and then coming round and just finishing off. Let me do that again so you can see. Pushing up, take the pressure off. And the letter P is very similar. Start at the line for baseline for X height, push up to the letter P, and then this last stroke, and I'll just do it again, this last stroke is either straight or goes up. If you make that stroke curved, you get that very ugly juxtaposition of strokes. And then if you're going to do the last letter in this family, if you're going to do a K, which is a closed bowl as opposed to an open bowl, this is the bowl, then this comes in this family. And just a little tip to get a lovely stroke is there's the bowl, start from the downstroke and come out, and you get that fabulous whisper there. Can you see? Just there, which you don't get if you just stick that last stroke onto the bowl. This letter family is based on the letter O, the oval O. And the strokes for this are quite smooth. Remember, the O is a narrow letter. The aim is that the white space, the counter, is a lovely smooth oval, and the letter slants forward, but the counter is upright. This shape is upright. The letter C uses the first part of the letter O and then just a little flat top. Don't pull it down too much, don't make it into a fish hook. And even though this is a little bit advanced, if you turn your pen just to the left here and use the left-hand corner of the nib, you can make this rather nice little finish to the letter. Just turn it onto the left-hand corner of the nib and pull it down. The letter E uses the first part of the letter O and then the bowl, which should be above halfway or about halfway. If you make that bowl too large or too small, the letter looks silly. So about halfway. Now the family that's based on the letter A has that stroke which, like some of the others, you push right up to the top, and then this stroke is either flat or goes upwards. And by pushing that stroke up to the top, you get that lovely smooth inner curve and no angle. If that top stroke is pulled down, the letter shape is not very pleasant at all. The letter G is the letter A shape, and you push it down or pull it down to the descender, and then just very slightly push it along to make that slightly thicker at that point. That tail is probably a little bit too long. I've gone beyond the line for descenders, so let me just do that again. And also the ink wasn't flowing terribly well. You see, you have to take the pressure off there, otherwise it could splat. The letter Q is very similar. Just put a little tail on like that. And the letter D is one of the most difficult of letters because, come on, right, where do you start this downstroke? Too far away. And you get a horrible thickness there. So it is something that comes with practice so that you get that letter. Oh, sorry, that really wasn't a good shape bowl. Let's do another one. Push up. That there. And then down. This is the diagonal family, and the first letter is the letter V, and that should be about the width of that oval letter O. The important thing with the diagonal family is to know that that first stroke should be quite steep. If you don't make it steep, as here, the letter looks upright rather than slanting forwards. The W obviously is just two letter V's, and the Y, based on this family, just has a tail. If you just push that very slightly to thicken it, and you can see there that's quite an angle, and I just want to take the edge off that angle, so I just use the corner of my nib to do that. It doesn't always happen. Having said that, it'll probably happen again. Yes, it has. The X, first stroke is quite steep, and the X should have those cross, perhaps that's a little bit too low. This should be about halfway between the lines for X height. If you exaggerate both the entry and exit strokes and curve the actual strokes, you get a really ugly letter as there. But actually the X in italic is a very elegant letter. And Z has straight strokes Again, the width should be about the width of the oval letter O. And you'll have noticed that I actually flattened the nib to about 10 degrees for this second diagonal stroke, which is the third stroke. If I don't do that, that middle stroke is very thin and it gives a rather weak letter. Now the very last family are the family of odds. So I'm just going to do this on the same piece of paper. And the first letter, which doesn't fit any of the families in our family of odds, is the letter S. The letter S should be narrow. It's based on that oval letter O. And the curves should all be smooth. It should be like a swan's neck. If there are any kinks or bumps, then the swan is dead, and we don't want dead swans. I'm not going to do this now, but if you can, if you're looking at this on a laptop, turn it upside down because those two bowls should look about the same, but in fact the lower bowl should be slightly larger than the upper bowl, and that gives the letter its balance. The second letter, which doesn't fit the families, is the letter F. And this is a long letter. Crossbar goes just underneath the top guideline for X height. Ideally, these curves should be smooth. And these strokes are relatively flat. Oh dear, that's not so good at all. I'm faking this here. Crossbar just below the lines for X height. If you hook these strokes, you get a really sort of ugly pinched letter. So allow the letter room to breathe. And then if you have two letters F together, it's sometimes quite nice to do the first letter with both curves and the second letter with just one curve. Like that.